In this video, we'll look at slavery in New Spain, primarily in the 1500s, and then how slavery operated throughout the Caribbean later on in the 1600s. Certainly in the Caribbean, the need to produce sugar drove the demand for slaves. Sugar cultivation was a very laborious process. The momentum for the importation of black slaves was so great that by the end of the 1600s, many islands in the Caribbean were actually overpopulated with blacks, beyond the demand of the resources available to sustain them all. Part of the reason for the high importation rates was the high mortality rates. It was, of course, a hot climate, and the number of deaths outstripped the number of births. But again, the importation was so high, there was overpopulation nevertheless. Slavery in the Caribbean was especially harsh. Many Europeans, especially the Dutch and later English, saw the climate as so hot and sticky they had no intention of staying there permanently. The islands, therefore, really weren't considered a place of residence, but merely as a potential source of wealth. Now, this meant that there was no interest on their behalf in developing the cultural institutions that would really improve life for everybody. Because black slaves were constantly being brought in from Africa, the Europeans found it necessary to develop the practice of breaking in newcomers, or as it became known, seasoning them. Now, in some instances, newcomers were distributed with veterans to teach them how to behave, and while on the other hand, they could do just the opposite. They would segregate newcomers and give them a special staff of guardians, inspectors to teach them. Regardless, the death rate for newcomers was even higher, up to 30%, and this coming, I might remind you, after the high mortality rates of the Middle Passages. New diseases, the change of climate, food scarce, suicides, the excessive flogging, all of that contributed to the high mortality rates. Slaves were often sent to the sugar fields at daybreak, and they'd work all day except for a 30-minute break for breakfast and a 2-hour period in the hottest part of the day. Still, even during this 2-hour hot part of the day, they were just assigned lighter chores, just not in the direct sunlight of the fields. Pregnant women were forced to work up to the point of childbirth. They usually got 1 month or so for a maternity leave, meaning, again, only no field labor. And pregnant women could be whipped harshly if they couldn't keep up. Food as a whole was insufficient, as I've said. As a rule, planters didn't encourage any type of diversified agriculture which would have provided the food for the workers. Slaves were usually given small plots of land, sometimes far from their huts, and only then with a few spare moments for cultivation. Punishments included first whipping, then branding on the face with a hot iron. And if an owner killed a slave, there's no punishment as long as he claimed it was an accident. Whipping was done with a plated cowhide, and it was very easy to draw blood. Nasty. Another punishment would be to suspend the slave from a tree by a rope and tie iron weights around his or her neck and waist. Another really nice thing, huh? Harsh treatment was easy because of the large importation and the emerging glut and surplus of slaves. As I said, there's simply less incentive to take it easy on them, to be kind. Such harsh treatment led to a number of attempted revolts. Now keep in mind that on the Caribbean islands, the number of blacks outnumbered the number of whites. Just to give you some example, in 1673 Jamaica, there were 10,000 blacks and 8,000 whites. In 1724, about 50 years later, Jamaica had 32,000 blacks and only 14,000 whites. Often slaves would run away to the mountains on the islands and become known as maroons. Maroons would then harass white planters by stealing and enticing the other slaves to join them. And maroons ultimately resulted in the addition of thousands of European troops. It just wasn't cost effective for the planters to go out and hunt down the escaped slaves because the importation rates are so great and slaves were so cheap. One of the most famous revolts was by an African-born slave in Haiti named Mackendal. In 1758, he announced that he was the Black Messiah, sent to drive whites from the island. He planned to poison the whites' water supply and enlist the support of the Maroons. But trying to coordinate it all was, of course, difficult, and his plans got out, and the fear-stricken planners hunted him down, captured him, and executed him. He's honored in Haiti today with, you can see on the left, the statue and his likeness on a coin. By the mid-1700s, with the North American colonies growing, along with their demand for slaves, the Caribbean itself became a major exporter to North America of slaves. Now, by this point, a slave who had served in the Caribbean was more valuable in North America because, he was obviously tougher. He had proved himself. He had survived, if nothing else. And the prices for them were higher. In the islands themselves, the land began to be exhausted from years of intensive sugar cultivation, and the area's economic importance began to diminish, as did for their need for slaves there. In general, slavery in the Caribbean differed from the developing slavery in North America. In the Caribbean, where the Spanish and Portuguese had colonies, there were fewer of these Spanish and Portuguese relative to the large number of Africans. If you compare that to North America that would develop a bit later, there were larger numbers of English and French and Dutch and so forth than there were relative to the number of blacks, certainly in the northern North America. Anyway, whenever you saw a larger number of Africans relative to the number of Europeans, you tended to have harsher slave codes, slave rules. And wherever the blacks were fewer in number, they tended to be more incorporated into the population, more readily incorporated, I should say. In any event, this concludes the video on slavery in the Caribbean.